Why is my deceased father still writing to me? It's sad to think that so many people become strangers to their parents when they get older. Sometimes they have good reason to, but often they just don't see them as a person. At least, not the one they once were. Steep bills, hospital visits, and lack of cognitive function can quickly turn a loved one into a liability. I wish I could say I stuck around for my dad because of a sense of pure altruism, but that would make me a liar. My dad and I had never been as close as either of us wanted. I was a bit of a hellion in my youth, and that put a strain on our relationship, especially when Mom died. Even still, when he delivered the news that he'd been diagnosed with throat cancer a couple of years ago, I offered to move back in to help take care of him and the house. After all, living in my childhood home rent-free seemed way better than barely affording to live in the worst apartment block in town. When Dad lost his voice, we began passing notes. It seemed the obvious way for us to communicate. Whenever I'd get in trouble when I was a kid, he'd always slip a note under my bedroom door a few hours later with some stupid joke about what I'd done and telling me to take out the trash for a week or some other menial punishment, before telling me that he and Mom would always love me, even though I could speak perfectly well and he could hear me just fine. Passing notes back and forth with him now seemed natural and very personal. About a year and a half ago, I was making lunch for myself in the kitchen when I heard a fall from Dad's room. I rushed upstairs to find him wrapped in bed sheets and sprawled out next to his bed, his breathing ragged and laborious. It wasn't until I managed to get him to sit back up in his bed that I noticed tears silently streaming down his creased cheeks. His shoulders trembled, and for the first time, I realized how much weight he'd lost. He looked small, his skin hanging loose on his frame as he began to shuffle towards the other side of his bed. He struggled to grab his pen and notepad from his bedside table. It pained me to see his hands struggle to write down just a few words, arthritis and chemo destroying his fine motor skills. He handed me the notepad, and it took me a few seconds to decipher the chicken scratch that had once been meticulous handwriting. It hurt so much. I had to step outside for air after that. Had things really gotten so bad so quickly? It seemed like just a couple of months ago that he was lively, energetic even. We'd cook dinner together and play games in the living room. As I sat on the front porch, contemplating what I could do for him, my thoughts were interrupted by the piercing screech of old brakes. A white van, creaking and rusty, had pulled into the neighbor's driveway. Two men emerged from the van and quickly began unloading equipment from its back: a folding bed, bulky oxygen tanks, and a dialysis machine, from what I could tell. A young woman casually stepped out of the passenger side door, a clipboard in hand, bubblegum blowing from her mouth as she leaned against the painted logo. Havens Bridge Hospice Care. I knew the man that owned the house they were at. Mr. Prescott had lived there all my life, never having any family to share his home with. He'd been nice, if quiet, every time I'd interacted with him, and occasionally growing up, he'd even come over for dinner. Hospice care. Not what I'd hoped I'd have to resort to this soon, but with my dad's quickly worsening condition and our treatment options dwindling, at least it would ease his pain in his last months. Still sitting on the porch, I made a decision that my father's suffering wouldn't last a second longer. I decided to call the number on the back of the van. It rang for a few moments, and to my surprise, I watched the woman leaning against the van with her clipboard pull her phone out of her pocket and answer. Havens Bridge, how can we help you? I told her to look up and waved her down before hanging up. We were both chuckling when I walked up to their van, and she kept her clipboard in hand, making notes as I explained my father's situation. She seemed to listen almost absent-mindedly until I finished, and when I was done, She immediately turned a page on her clipboard and began reading off a series of questions, hardly looking up from the fresh intake form. Name of patient? Is he ambulatory? Can he swallow by himself? I gave her all the information she needed, and she took a few seconds to make some hasty notes before blowing another bubble with her gum, then seemingly swallowing it. She tore off a section of paper and handed it to me, a different phone number scrawled across it. This is Marla. She'll most likely be the nurse assigned to your father's care. Call her this afternoon and she'll come over for an evaluation. I was shocked at how quickly this was progressing. Just half an hour ago, I'd been helping Dad get back into bed, and now I'd already booked him end-of-life care. Marla showed up that afternoon, gave Dad a once-over evaluation, and said that Havens Bridge would be happy to assist my dad in his final months. I winced and cut her a look, silently protesting her using those words in front of him. We all knew it was getting close to that time, but I'd expect better bedside manners from a hospice worker. The next morning, the same men unloaded equipment at the house. Tanks of oxygen, IV bags, and drips. The works. My father was quieter than usual as they set up. As they were finishing assembling some of the equipment, Dad handed me his notepad and pen. Is it supposed to be this fast? I looked up at the men who were wheeling some expensive-looking monitor into his bedroom. They hadn't so much as looked at Dad since they got here. I wrote back. Maybe. They seemed busy with Mr. Prescott yesterday. They might just have a lot of clients. He sat still in his wheelchair for a moment. After a minute or two, he handed me the notepad once more. If you're sure about this, thank you, Andrew. I love you. It was about a month later when the email I'd been waiting for came in. A last-ditch job application effort had finally resulted in an invitation to interview at their corporate office, out of state. I looked over at Dad, who was asleep in bed as Marla did her daily check-in process. The thought of leaving here, even for just a couple days, made me nervous. Hey Marla, how's he doing? There's a chance I may have to leave for a day or two, for a work opportunity. She glanced up from her work, meeting my gaze for only a second before returning to take readings from the monitors wired around Dad's bed. He's doing all right. He's tired, though. She looked back up at me for a moment and hushed her voice to avoid waking her sleeping patient. He's got a few weeks left. If you need to go, do it now while you still have that time. If anything happens while you're not here, our equipment will let us know, and we'll be here to help him within an hour. She gestured towards one of the screens displaying his vitals. She began to pack up her equipment for the day, and I sat down next to Dad. As she left, he slowly opened his eyes, glossy and wet with tears. He took several minutes to write down a short note, before gently placing it in my hand and falling back asleep. Go. I'll be here when you get back. As the plane landed the following afternoon, I looked out the window at the new city sprawled before me. Clouds hung above skyscrapers, like I'd never seen. I wondered which one I would hopefully be working in soon. The flight attendant's voice called from the front of the plane, informing us that we could unfasten our seatbelts and use our electronics again. As soon as I turned my phone off of airplane mode, 3 missed calls appeared on my screen. I didn't have the phone number saved, but I recognized the number. It was the number I'd first called to reach out to Havens Bridge. My hands clammed up, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand tall with knowing anticipation. I called back. Hello? A woman's voice rang back at me, soft but clinical, the woman I'd spoken to in Mr. Prescott's driveway. Good afternoon. This is Havens Bridge. How can we help you? Yes, hi. This is Andrew Reeves. I have a few missed calls from you. What's going on? There was a pause, long enough for my stomach to tie a knot of itself. I knew. I'm sorry for this, but we're calling regarding your father. He passed on earlier this morning. A hollow, weightless silence. I exhaled slowly, pressing a clammy hand against my forehead. I stuttered. I wasn't sure what else to say. They'd told me he had weeks left. We know you're out of town, so we've gone ahead and taken care of everything, she continued. Our remote monitors signaled that he passed in his sleep at 11:03 this morning, and the body was picked up at 3:15 Halloween at 11:42 a.m. Given the circumstances, we want to make this process as seamless for you as possible. The remains have already been cremated per your request. Havens Bridge wants to cover the memorial expenses for the trouble. Thank you. That means a lot. Wait, he's already been cremated? It was standard procedure, but I wasn't there. I didn't get to sign off on that yet. A pause. I could hear typing on a keyboard. You listed disposition at the hospice's discretion on the paperwork, she said. You agreed to cremation upon passing. I closed my eyes. Had I? I only vaguely remembered signing forms related to post-mortem conditions. We wanted to avoid burdening you with the details, she added. We understand how difficult this time is. I swallowed. My head felt light, detached from my body. Right, I murmured. Wait, hold on. 3:15 Halloway? Do you mean 3:18? That's where my dad was. A brief silence. Then, a polite, dismissive laugh. Of course, you're right. I'm so sorry, it's been a long morning for all of us here. That's fine. I brushed it off. What about the remains? Would you like us to ship them to you? I hesitated. No, I'll pick them up. Of course. A click of a keyboard. Again, our condolences, Mr. Reeves. We exchanged a few more details, and she hung up. I sat there for a while, staring at my phone, until eventually it was my turn to stand and collect my carry-on before disembarking the plane. I walked towards baggage claim, feeling hollow. I knew it had been coming for a while, but the reality of it was only just setting in. Teary-eyed, I pulled his last note to me out of my pocket and reread as my bags arrived. The crumpled page almost fell apart in my hands. The sweat of my fingers smeared the lettering. I would have taken much better care of it if I'd known it were his last words to me. I'll be here when you get back. I got the job. I don't know how I managed to do it, but for the duration of my interview, I must have put myself on autopilot, cruising through handshakes and panel questions. I arrived back at my father's home a few days later, already having made up my mind. I couldn't live here anymore anyways, seeing as I'd start the new job much sooner than I'd anticipated. But now, there was nothing tying me here. This would be my last time here. I trudged up the stairs and began to tear up as I looked down the hall towards my father's bedroom. Never again would he lay there sick, and never again would we sit next to each other, passing notes, joking about sports, or the antics of the neighborhood squirrels. I walked up, wanting to go in one more time, but I couldn't bear to turn the doorknob. He was gone, and it felt like an intrusion to go in without him there. A holdover emotion from when I was a kid. I could worry about his things or selling the house later. For now, I just had to worry about moving everything that was mine. I began to pack up what little I needed from my room, and within an hour, my bags were packed, and I was ready to leave. There was no way I'd be hauling Dad's furniture to Chicago, so other than my personal effects, it was best to leave the house how it was. Dad had left it to me after all, and with the cushiness of the new job, I could afford my own place and my own stuff in the new city. I could retire here, I thought to myself. But later, when it feels less empty, when I have my own wife and kids to fill its rooms, I was making my last haul to load my belongings into my car when I saw it. A note folded neatly on the side table in the entryway of the home. Dad must have written it for me after I left, the night before he died. Marla must have left it here for me, bless her. I felt blood rush to my cheeks, and for the first time since he passed, I smiled genuinely. I picked it up and very gently unfolded it, careful not to tear or smudge it. My face dropped as I opened it and read its short contents. I want to leave. Where are you? I felt a hot tear roll down my face. Dad knew I had left for Chicago. At least I had thought so. Did he misunderstand where I was going? Was he so out of it in his last hours that he couldn't remember where I was? Had I left my father, scared and alone, when he died? I set the note down where I found it and quickly got the rest of my stuff. I took one last look inside the house and left, never wanting to go back. I'd been working the new position for a year when I found the note. After months of settling in, finding a place to stay, and finding my place, I finally worked up the courage to start going through some of Dad's old things that I'd brought with me. Old journals, a laptop, his baseball card collection, things I was familiar with but hadn't had the nerve to unpack since I moved. I was flipping through one of my old yearbooks that he'd kept when a slip of paper poked out from between some of the latter pages. I flipped to where it lay and was greeted by a photo of me and my first girlfriend preparing for a pep rally my sophomore year. I smiled and turned my attention to the note nestled in the crease. My dad's handwriting was immediately recognizable, still messier than it used to be. It was distinctly his. You two were so happy together. She's still so kind. I smiled. Gwen's braced smile beamed at me through the pages, her freckled face framed with black bangs that she kept even through senior year. Dad was right. We were happy together. I wondered when he'd written the note. Clearly after he got sick, based on the handwriting. I wondered how many other notes he'd left for me, hidden like time capsules for me to find while reminiscing. His wording caught me as odd, however. I wondered why Dad would phrase it like that, like he still knew her, that she was still kind. I puzzled over it for a minute and realized that he was probably referring to when she showed up to Mom's funeral after I graduated. We'd been broken up for months at that point, but she was there. I smiled. She had been such a nice girl. I started finding more of Dad's little time capsule notes after that. The second one showed up about 2 weeks later, tucked between my back seats when I was cleaning out my car. Don't forget your oil change, it mentioned. I chuckled and made a mental note that, funnily enough, I was due for a tune-up sooner rather than later. The third and fourth I found within a couple days of each other, one half buried in the drying dirt of a dying houseplant I'd brought from Dad's, reminding me to water it. The other tucked inside a Stephen King book that was one of Dad's favorites. You'll like this next part. And he was right. The twist got me good. I found more and more of my dad, increasingly revealing himself in my life. It felt like a blessing to find pieces of a loved one, as alive as he'd ever been, hidden all around me. That's what I thought, at least. I was putting away a few of Dad's things in the closet when I dropped the yearbook, and the note about Gwen fell out again. I picked it up and noticed something I'd missed before, a phone number written on the back of it. After 3 years of dialing it by hand on my old flip phone, back in school, I recognized it instantly. Gwen's cell number. Nostalgia shot through me, and I hesitated. Emotion quickly drowned out reason. Surely she's moved on with her life like I had. But where was the harm in calling her up? As an old friend, maybe she would even pick up. I dialed the number in, and the phone rang for a few long moments. And just when I was about to hang up, someone answered. A man's voice, tired and hollow, answered the phone. Hello? Who is this? How'd you get this number? I felt my heart sink for just a second. It had been 15 years after all. It made sense that the number wouldn't be hers anymore. I'm sorry, I figured this wouldn't work. I was trying to call up an old friend, Gwen Matthews. The man paused for a second and shocked me. No, You have the right phone number. This is Omar, Gwen's husband. May I ask who this is? He seemed tense. Oh, sorry to bother you. My name is Andrew Reeves. I was a friend of Gwen's from high school. I I found her number again and just wanted to check in. There was silence for a second, but he answered, well, Andrew, I'm sorry to tell you this, but, I heard his voice break. Gwen passed a few years back. She was in an accident. I'd kind of assumed everyone who knew her already heard. Anyways, I didn't even know her phone was still turned on until you called. I'll be shutting it off tonight. Thanks for calling. A click, and he hung up. I sat there in shock. I hadn't known what to expect, but I just couldn't believe she was gone. I was in a haze for the next few days. Why'd Dad tell me she was still kind? Did he know she was gone? Why didn't I know that she'd died? I guess that's what happens when you don't speak to someone for 15 years. They move on. Sometimes they pass on. I couldn't stay frazzled forever, though. I had a shareholder meeting to prepare for. A potential promotion rode on the results, so I'll admit I splurged and bought a new suit and binder to look extra professional. In the middle of the meeting, I found Dad's next note. I opened my binder to remove some documents, and out fell a pristine sheet of paper, one I hadn't placed there when I meticulously prepared for the meeting the night before. I quickly put it aside to get to my documents, but it immediately caught my eye. I had only bought this binder last week, and I certainly didn't own this notepad back when I lived with Dad. But there it was, unmistakably, in Dad's handwriting. Good luck, Andrew. I love you. The impossibility of the note perplexed me. Driving home from work that day, I puzzled it over in my head until it made even less sense than before. There was no way that he had put the note in the binder, as I had only bought it a week prior, and there was definitely no way that it had somehow gotten shuffled around when I was unpacking and ended up in there. It was in pristine, unfolded condition. I couldn't make any sense of it. More notes started appearing in places that, in hindsight, always should have set off alarm bells in my head. I'm cold, I found underneath my fridge when I was sweeping. The next morning, I booted up Dad's old laptop again, only for a note to slip out of the disk drive. I'm not feeling any better. Can you help me? It was one of his most recent notes that led to where we are now. I returned home from work one day, frazzled that I'd found a letter, seemingly from him, in my packed lunch. I opened my mailbox and began sorting through my mail, when one letter stuck out like a sore thumb among the rest. A final bill with a familiar logo was nestled between advertisements. A bill from Havens Bridge. Written on the back of the envelope, my father's handwriting scrawled, "When are you coming home? I miss you." I lost it. I tore open the envelope. This had to be coming from them somehow. My father had been dead for well over a year at this point. I had attended his funeral. His ashes sat on my fireplace. Someone was writing me notes to mess with me, and it had to be them. The bill was fairly standard, albeit with a hefty late payment fee attached. I scoffed that they'd send me one this long after everything concluded, but almost everything seemed in order. Bills for oxygen tanks depleted, moving time, and in-home care. Everything seemed exactly as it should. No message, no taunt with my father's handwriting, no ghostly scrawl. It wasn't until I was about to throw the note away when I caught it, in the fine line print at the very bottom of the bill. Services rendered to Andrew Reeves, 315 Halloway Drive. Those idiots had messed up the address again. No wonder it took so long to forward this bill to my new address. I wondered how many other late payments had been incurred by the clerical error. Furious, I called the number for Havens Bridge, now saved to my phone. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Haven and Hospice, how can we help? I'll admit, I was curt, harsh even with my tone. Listen, I'm calling about a billing issue. My name's Andrew Reeves. My father, Richard Reeves, was in your care last year. I was finally forwarded his bill, and I want to contest these late fees, seeing as it was you guys who got the address wrong again. A pause, then the faint click of a keyboard. One moment. I waited, listening to the faint murmur of voices in the background. Then another pause, longer this time. I'm sorry, Mr. Reeves. I seem to be having some trouble pulling up your father's file. I scoffed. That can't be right. I have your bill right here. You guys did hospice care, cremation, funeral arrangements, everything. Your nurse Marla was at his house almost every day for a month. Right, of course, more typing. Give me 1 second. Let me check something else. There was a shuffle, like she was flipping through papers. I heard a hushed voice, another woman in the background. Then, just clear enough to make out. Wait, this wasn't the Holloway mix-up, was it? The cold pit in my stomach opened wide. What? The line clicked. Call ended. It was hard to get time off of work to get back home to Dad's place. But by the end of the month, I convinced my boss to let me have a long weekend to fly back home. I splurged on the in-flight Wi-Fi. I wanted to do as much digging on Haven's Bridge as I could before I got back to Dad's. Nothing was adding up. What I found online was scarce. They were a family-owned business that had only been in operation for a couple of years by the time I found them. They specialized in elder care and end-of-life treatment, but their reviews weren't the best. When I'd booked, I'd known all this. But for the price point, they were about all I could afford at the time. What was more worrying was that they had very recently been shut down. From the articles I could find, they'd closed just days after my last phone call with them. One forum post from my dad's city even claimed that they had mishandled remains, and there was an ongoing lawsuit. None of this was comforting. The taxi pulled up to my childhood home. I was sad to see that it had fallen into almost a state of disrepair in my year absence. I could have at least called a company to take care of the lawn, but I hadn't even done that. Tall, dead grass carpeted the lawn, and the windows were caked with what looked like dirt. It wasn't until I arrived closer to the house and my stomach dropped as I realized the filth was moving. Thousands of flies, buzzing and landing inside on the glass. I swallowed hard and put my key in the door. I barely turned the handle and cracked it when the smell hit me like a dead fish. My eyes watered and I pushed my way inside, fighting back the flies that pushed past me to escape into the fresh afternoon air. It was several minutes worth of coughing and opening every window I could find. Downstairs that I paused to let myself breathe and get my bearings. I wish I hadn't. There were hundreds, no, thousands, of scrawled letters on the ground. Some were crumpled, some in perfect condition. Most of them rotting and covered in dead insects. I picked up one that seemed relatively fresh and unspoiled, and to my dismay, it still held a damp, slimy texture. I peeled it open, and it read, "Will you be back soon? Please let me out." I knew what I'd find before I even started walking upstairs. The smell had hung heavy in the ground floor foyer, but the stench of rot only grew more sickly sweet with every step I took towards my father's room. By the time I made it to his door, I had to put my shirt over my nose. Just to keep myself from vomiting, I grabbed the handle and started to twist, only to realize, with a gut-wrenching understanding, that it had been locked. I pulled out the old house key from my keyring and fidgeted with the lock. As soon as the key clicked, the door flung open. My father's withered body pushed it out towards me. He'd been leaned up against it. The inside of the door was covered in deep scratches, splintered wood caked in long dried blood covering the floor. His fingers had been whittled down to bone, his hands mangled and still grasping to claw towards an escape. I turned away from what lay before me, and I vomited. I wiped my mouth clean and slowly walked past my father into his old room. Every single piece of hospice equipment was inside. The monitors, long knocked over and broken, covered in flies and filth. They'd forgotten him. I was reeling, struggling to understand the sight before me. How had they not known? How had they left him here to die? Whose ashes did I have in an urn at home? I couldn't bear the smell anymore. So I cracked open my father's window and caught a glimpse of Mr. Prescott's house across the street, similarly overgrown. No family or friends to take care of it. His house had gone the way of my dad's. It wasn't until I looked at his house number, 315 Holloway, that the realization hit me like a brick. I turned away from the window, my head spinning, and I shifted my gaze towards the door. My father's body was gone. A pool of blood and wood splinters where he had laid it was all that remained in his place. My heart sank as I looked at the scratches he'd left on the back of his door. They were bloody and messy, but I could now clearly see that they were words. Thank you for coming home. Thank you for watching today's video. Please like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed.